Sometimes goodness comes like a silent storm, sweeping away everything we thought we knew about right and wrong. The sun was beginning to bid farewell to the mountains when Thomas Mitchell heard the low moans coming from the stream. He had stopped there only to give his horse water after 3 days of riding in the merciless heat of the Arizona desert. The sound was faint, almost imperceptible, but there was something about it that made Thomas forget the thirst and fatigue he carried in his bones. Following the noise, he found a small figure bent between the stones on the bank. He was a boy, not more than 12 years old, with torn and stained clothes. His legs were injured, cut by the sharp stones, and he shivered even under the heat that still radiated from the red earth. Thomas immediately recognized the features of his face, the color of his skin tanned by the desert sun. He was a native boy. For a moment, Thomas hesitated. There were stories told in the halls of nearby cities, stories about conflicts, about mistrust that ran deep like cactus roots. But when the boy's dark eyes met his own, Thomas saw only fear and pain. He saw no enemy. He saw only one child who needed help. The cowboy knelt slowly, keeping his hands in sight. The boy tried to move away, but his injured legs would not allow it. Thomas spoke in a calm voice, even though he knew he might not be understood. His words were simple, repeated like a soft song. Gradually, the boy stopped trying to flee and allowed Thomas to examine his wounds. The cuts were deep, made by sharp stones during what appeared to have been a fall. Thomas tore off pieces of his own shirt and dipped the cloths in the fresh water of the stream. With the care of a father, he cleaned each wound, ignoring the small moans of pain that escaped from the boy's lips. When he finished, he used the rest of his shirt to make improvised bandages. The boy looked exhausted, his eyes closing from time to time. Thomas realized that he hadn't eaten in days. From his saddlebag, he removed pieces of dried meat and his canteen with fresh water. He offered everything with slow gestures, showing that there was no danger. The boy ate slowly, always watching Thomas with eyes that carried premature wisdom. When darkness began to cover the desert like a thick blanket, Thomas made a decision that would change everything. He could not leave the boy there, alone and wounded. His cabin was only a few hours away from riding, a simple but safe place where the boy could recover properly. With gestures, Thomas explained his intention. The boy hesitated, looking at the horizon as if expecting to see something or someone. After long minutes, he nodded. Thomas helped him onto his horse, positioning him in front so he could support him during the trip. The ride was silent, punctuated only by the clatter of hooves on land and the night wind that carried the distant sounds of the desert. Thomas felt the weight of the responsibility he had taken, but also a strange peace. He had done the right thing, of that he was sure. When they arrived at the hut, Thomas lit a small fire and prepared a comfortable place for the boy to rest. He changed the bandages, applied herbs he knew for their healing properties, and offered more food. The boy ate with more appetite this time, and Thomas noticed some color coming back to his cheeks. Before going to sleep, the boy touched Thomas's arm and whispered a few words in his native language. Thomas did not understand the words, but he understood the tone. It was gratitude, pure and simple. He just nodded and covered the boy with his warmest blanket. Thomas lay awake for a long time, watching the flames of the campfire dance and thinking about what he had done. He knew that some men in the nearby town would not approve of his choice. But there, on that quiet night, with the boy resting safely, Thomas felt that he had honored something greater than the prejudices and fears that divided people. What he didn't know was that at that very moment, 60 pairs of eyes were watching his cabin from the top of the nearby hills, and that the dawn would bring with it a situation that would test not only his courage, but also his faith in human goodness. Thomas woke up even before sunrise, as he had always done 15 years ago, living alone in the desert. But this time, something was different. The silence that surrounded him was not the usual silence of the early morning. It was a heavy silence, charged with expectation, like the air before a storm. He stood up slowly, taking care not to wake the boy who was still sleeping soundly near the dead embers of the fire. The bandages looked clean, with no signs of bleeding, and the child's breathing was calm. Thomas felt a quiet relief as he saw that the wounds were healing well. It was when he went to the window that Thomas saw it. They were there, immovable like desert stones, forming a perfect semicircle around your property. 60 men, perhaps more, mounted on horses that looked like statues in the dim light of dawn. Their faces were expressionless, but Thomas could feel the tension radiating from each of them like waves of heat. Thomas's heart raced, but his hands remained steady. He had lived long enough in the West to recognize a delicate situation when he saw it. Those men were not there by chance. They were looking for something, or someone. Thomas looked at the sleeping boy and understood immediately. The child was not alone in the desert by accident. He had a family, a tribe that had certainly spent the whole night looking for him. And now they had found their footprints, which led them directly to Thomas's cabin. For a few long minutes, no one moved. The warriors remained in their positions, waiting. Thomas knew that they could have attacked during the night, if they had wanted to. The fact that they were waiting meant something. Perhaps they respected the fact that he had helped the boy, or maybe they were just waiting for a better opportunity. Thomas put on his shirt slowly, checking that his pistol was in place, not out of aggressiveness, but just in case. Then he made the most important decision of his life. He opened the door of the hut and left, keeping his hands visible and away from the gun. The morning air was cold against his skin, but Thomas felt beads of sweat forming on his forehead. He walked a few steps towards the nearest group and stopped. One of the men, clearly the leader by the way the others watched him, dismounted from his horse and walked toward Thomas. He was a tall man with braided grey hair and scars that told stories of battles and survival. His eyes were piercing, but Thomas saw no hatred in them. He saw concern, caution, and something that could be hope. The two men stood face to face for long seconds. The leader spoke a few words in his native tongue, words that Thomas did not understand, but whose tone was clearly a question. Thomas pointed gently to the cabin and waved, indicating that the boy was inside, safe. It was then that they heard a faint voice coming from the hut. The boy had woken up and was calling for someone. The native leader raised his head quickly, and Thomas saw something turn on his face. It was pure relief, the relief of a father who finds his lost son. Thomas gestured for the man to follow him to the cabin. Inside, the boy was sitting, still wrapped in the blanket, but alert. When he saw the leader, his eyes filled with tears, and he spoke quickly in his language, pointing to Thomas several times. The cowboy watched the conversation without understanding the words, but perfectly understanding what was happening. The boy was telling how Thomas had found him, tended to his wounds, fed, and protected him through the night. He was explaining that the white man was not an enemy, but rather someone who had shown kindness when he could have simply gone his way. The leader listened to everything in silence, his eyes alternating between his son and Thomas. When the boy finished talking, the man approached Thomas and placed a hand on his shoulder. He said something in his language, and though Thomas did not understand the words, the tone was unmistakably one of gratitude. Thomas nodded respectfully and helped the boy to his feet, offering support as he tested his injured legs. The cuts were still sensitive, but the boy was able to walk. Thomas took a few strips of clean cloth and handed them to the leader, gesturing to indicate that the bandages should be changed regularly. What happened next completely surprised Thomas. The leader took a small object from his belt and offered it to the cowboy. It was an amulet made of stone and leather, handcrafted with symbols that Thomas did not recognize, but that clearly had sacred meaning. Thomas hesitated for a moment, understanding the honor that was being offered. Then he accepted the gift with reverence, bowing his head slightly as a sign of respect. The leader smiled for the first time, a small but genuine smile. Father and son headed out of the hut, where the other warriors were waiting. Thomas accompanied them, watching as the boy was carefully helped to mount one of the horses. Before they left, the boy looked at Thomas and waved, his face lit up with a smile the cowboy would never forget. One by one, the warriors began to move away, disappearing into the hills like shadows that dissolve in daylight. The leader was the last to leave, looking one last time at Thomas with what seemed to be a silent promise that this act of kindness would not be forgotten. Thomas stood in front of his hut until the last night disappeared over the horizon. Then he looked at the amulet in his hands and smiled. He had learned something important that morning. Kindness spoke a universal language, which could be understood even when words failed. The days that followed passed with a tranquility that Thomas had not experienced in a long time. The amulet rested on the table of his cabin, constantly reminding him of the encounter that had changed his perspective on so many things. He went back to his usual routine, caring for the few animals he owned and making the necessary repairs to the property. But something had changed in his heart. In the third week after the incident, Thomas decided to ride to the town of Red Canyon to buy supplies. It was a trip he made every month, always with a certain reluctance. The city was small, but full of men who talked too loudly and drank more than they should. Thomas preferred the solitude of his cabin, but needs were needs. Red Canyon was busier than usual when Thomas arrived. There were extra wagons on the main street and more horses tied up in front of the hall. He tied up his own horse and walked into the general store, discreetly greeting merchant Jake Peterson, a middle-aged man who had always been fair in his dealings. As he chose the necessary supplies, Thomas couldn't help but listen to the lively conversation that was taking place in the corner of the store. Three men were discussing something with great agitation, their voices increasing in pitch with each sentence. What Thomas heard made his blood run cold. They talked about recent attacks on nearby farms, about stolen cattle and cut fences, and above all, they talked about how it was time to solve once and for all the problem with the natives of the region. The words were charged with hatred and a thirst for revenge, and Thomas realized that they were organizing some kind of expedition. One of the men, whom Thomas recognized as Cal Morrison, a farmer known for his brutal treatment of his workers, slammed his fist on the table and declared that he was tired of waiting for the law, that it was time to take justice into his own hands. Thomas continued his shopping, but his ears remained attentive to the conversation. I learned that they planned to leave at dawn, armed and determined to find the nearest native camp. Morrison spoke of sending a message that would never be forgotten. When Thomas finished his shopping and headed for the exit, Morrison intercepted him. He was a big man, with the thick arms of those who work hard, but there was something cruel in his eyes that had always bothered Thomas. Morrison asked if Thomas would like to join them on the expedition. He talked about how they needed brave men, how it was the duty of every farmer in the region to protect their land. Thomas replied that he wasn't interested, trying to keep his voice neutral. The answer did not please Morrison. He moved closer, questioning whether Thomas had become a native sympathizer. Other men joined the conversation, and Thomas felt the tension rise around him. He kept calm, repeated that he was not interested and tried to leave. Morrison blocked his exit and asked a question that made Thomas alert. He asked if it was true that someone had seen native horse tracks near Thomas's property a few weeks ago. The question was asked in a casual tone, but Thomas realized the trap behind it. Thomas replied that he knew nothing about footprints and that he spent most of his time tending to his own property. Morrison watched him for long seconds, as if trying to detect lies, but Thomas kept his expression impassive. Finally, Morrison walked away, but not before making one last observation. He said he hoped all the men in the area would know which side they were on when the moment of truth came. Thomas just waved and walked out of the shop. During the entire ride back, Thomas could not get the conversation he had overheard out of his mind. He knew that Morrison and his followers were not men of conversation. When they talked about solving problems, it usually meant violence. And from the description they made, Thomas was sure that they were planning to attack exactly the tribe of the boy he had helped. He arrived home when the sun was already low on the horizon. He entered the hut and took the amulet, holding it in his callous hands. She thought about the boy, about his wounds, about the way she had trusted him. He thought of the native leader, of the gratitude in his eyes, of the honor he had shown. Thomas spent the whole night awake, walking around the cabin, looking out the window, weighing his options. He knew that if Morrison found out that he had helped the native boy, his life in the region would become impossible, maybe even dangerous. But he also knew that he could not simply stand by while innocent men were attacked. The boy who had taken care of him could be among the victims. The father, who had shown so much gratitude and dignity, might not see another dawn. When the first rays of sunlight began to illuminate the desert, Thomas had already made his decision. He saddled his horse, took his carbine and some supplies. He did not know exactly where he would find the native camp, but he knew the desert better than most men, and it had something that Morrison and his followers didn't have, a noble reason for their journey. As he rode toward the hills where he had seen the warriors disappear weeks earlier, Thomas held the amulet firmly in his pocket. He knew he was risking everything, his safety, his reputation, maybe even his life, but he also knew that some things were worth the risk. Kindness had planted a seed in his heart that night when he had found the wounded boy. Now it was time to see what kind of fruit it would bear. The desert seemed to stretch out endlessly under the relentless morning sun. Thomas had been riding for 3 hours, following almost invisible trails and trusting his intuition more than any set path. Time was against him. He knew that Morrison and his men were not experienced desert horsemen, but they had the advantage of numbers and blind determination. It was when he saw the distant smoke that Thomas knew he was on the right track. It was a thin, white column, rising gently toward the blue sky, the kind of smoke that came from a controlled campfire, used for cooking or warmth. His heart raced. It was close. Thomas slowed his horse's pace, approaching carefully. He didn't want to be mistaken for a threat. When you reach the top of a small elevation, you can see the camp below. It was smaller than he had imagined, perhaps 20 tents arranged in a semicircle next to a natural water source. Children played among the tents while women worked and men tended the horses. It was a peaceful scene, full of everyday life. Thomas felt his stomach tighten at the thought of what Morrison and his men intended to do with these people. He walked down the slope slowly, his hands clearly visible and away from any weapons. It didn't take long for him to be noticed. A young warrior spotted him first and gave a warning cry. Within seconds, several men emerged from the tents, some with bows drawn. Thomas stopped his horse and raised one hand in peace. With the other, he carefully removed the amulet from his pocket and held it up, hoping that it would be recognized. For long moments, nothing happened. Then a familiar figure emerged from one of the larger tents. It was the leader who had come to pick up the wounded boy. The man watched him for a few seconds before recognizing him. When this happened, his face transformed. He spoke a few words to the other warriors, who lowered their weapons and walked towards Thomas. When they met, the leader spoke a few words in his language and then tried a few words in English. Thomas realized that the man was asking why he had come. It was a fair question. Considering the circumstances, Thomas dismounted and, using gestures and the few words he knew, tried to explain the approaching danger. He pointed to the horizon from which he had come, made gestures indicating men on horseback, and showed an approximate number with his fingers. He tried to convey urgency in his movements. The leader seemed to partially understand, but Thomas could see confusion in his eyes. It was then that a familiar voice called his name. It was the boy who was running towards them. His legs were already completely healed, and he looked strong and healthy. The boy spoke briefly to his father, pointing to Thomas and gesturing excitedly. Thomas realized that the child was translating his attempts at communication. Gradually, the leader's face became more serious, finally understanding the gravity of the situation. The man shouted some orders, and the camp immediately went into operation. Women began to collect essential belongings. Men groomed horses. Children were gathered by their fathers. Thomas was impressed by the efficiency and discipline shown. The leader approached Thomas again and placed both hands on his shoulders. He spoke a few words that Thomas did not understand, but the tone was clearly one of deep gratitude. The cowboy waved, indicating that no thanks were necessary, but the leader wasn't done. He gestured for Thomas to wait and quickly disappeared into one of the tents. When he returned, he had something in his hands. It was a small but beautifully crafted headdress, with feathers that glistened in the sunlight. Thomas tried to refuse, feeling that he had received enough honor, but the leader insisted. He placed the headdress carefully in Thomas's hands and said a few words that seemed to have a deep ceremonial meaning. The boy then approached and, to Thomas's surprise, spoke a few words in English. They were simple words, clearly learned with difficulty, but perfectly understandable. The boy said that Thomas was now family, that he would always be welcome, and that his kindness would never be forgotten. Thomas felt a lump in his throat. He had never experienced this kind of acceptance, this feeling of belonging to something greater than himself. He placed a hand on the boy's shoulder and waved gratefully. The camp was almost completely dismantled when they heard the distant sound of horses approaching. Morrison and his men had arrived sooner than Thomas expected. The native leader gave a quick order, and the last preparations were accelerated. Thomas knew he had to leave. His presence there could complicate things for the tribe, especially if Morrison saw him. But I also knew that I couldn't just walk away and let these people face danger alone. It was then that he had an idea. He quickly mounted his horse and headed in the opposite direction to the one the tribe was taking. If it could draw Morrison's attention away from the camp, it would give the tribe enough time to escape completely. The sound of horses was closer now. Thomas could make out voices shouting orders. He spurred his horse and rode openly across the plain, making sure he would be seen. When he heard screams indicating that he had been sighted, he knew that his plan was working. Morrison and his men changed direction, following Thomas rather than the tribe. The cowboy knew the terrain better than they did, and his horse was rested while theirs had ridden for hours. He led them down difficult paths, through rocky terrain that would slow them down. For 2 hours, Thomas led the chase through the desert, always keeping enough distance not to be reached, but never so much that they lost their track. When he was finally sure that the tribe had enough time to pull away completely, Thomas used his superior knowledge of the terrain to outwit the pursuers. He hid among the rocks of a canyon as Morrison and his men walked by, screaming frustrations and curses. When the sounds of their voices finally faded into the distance, Thomas came out of his hiding place and looked down at the headdress in his hands. He had risked everything, but it had been worth it. He knew he would never again be the same lonely man he had been. He had found something bigger than himself, a connection that transcended differences of race or culture. He had found a family. The months that followed brought changes that Thomas had never imagined possible. Word of his involvement in the tribe's escape spread through Red Canyon like fire through dry grass. Morrison was unable to prove anything, but his suspicions were known to all. Thomas became a marked man in the city, shunned by some, quietly respected by others. But Thomas found that he didn't care as much as he thought. The solitude of his cabin no longer felt heavy or empty. On the contrary, it was filled with a peace he had never known before. The headdress rested in a place of honor on his desk, beside the original amulet, reminding him daily that there was something more valuable than the approval of the men of the city. It was on an autumn afternoon that Thomas saw the lone figure approaching on the horizon. It was the boy, now clearly taller and stronger, riding alone towards the cabin. Thomas stepped out to greet him, an involuntary smile welling up on his face. The boy dismounted and walked towards him with confident steps. His first words were in English, still with an accent, but clear and well articulated. He had been learning the language from a merchant who was visiting his tribe. He explained that his people had found a safe place to settle, away from the routes Morrison used to take. But the boy had not come just to say thank you. He brought an invitation. His tribe would hold a special ceremony on the next full moon to officially honor Thomas as a member of the family, as an adoptive brother. Thomas hesitated, asking if his presence would not bring trouble. The boy smiled and explained that the ceremony would be in a secret location, where Thomas could go back and forth without being seen. On the night of the full moon, Thomas found the entire tribe gathered around a large campfire in a hidden valley. The ceremony was both solemn and joyful. As the leader placed his hands on Thomas's head and uttered ritual words, the cowboy felt something deep move in his chest. It wasn't just acceptance I was receiving, it was genuine love. The boy served as a translator, explaining that Thomas was being recognized as the protector of the tribe, someone they could always rely on. In return, they would be his family forever, no matter the circumstances. When it was time to leave, the leader explained through the boy that there would always be room for Thomas among them, but that they understood if he preferred to continue living in his hut. The important thing was to know that I would never be alone again. The years passed, and Thomas grew old with dignity in his cabin in the desert. The boy, now a young adult, visited him regularly, always bringing news of the family that Thomas had gained. Sometimes other members of the tribe would come along, and the lonely hut would be filled with laughter and conversation. Morrison and his followers eventually lost interest in pursuing conflict. Thomas continued to be viewed with suspicion by some in the city, but that no longer bothered him. One spring morning, when Thomas was already in his final years, he found a small wooden cross planted near his home. He did not know who had put it there, but he knew what it meant. His kindness had touched more lives than he imagined. That night, sitting and watching the stars that shone over the desert, Thomas held the amulet and headdress in his hands. He thought about how a single decision to show compassion had completely changed the course of his life. He had learned that true wealth was not in the approval of others or in material security. It was in the genuine connection between human beings, in the courage to do the right thing even when it was difficult, and in the discovery that planted goodness always germinated, even in the most arid soil. The desert around him remained the same, but Thomas knew he had left his mark on it through love, and that was more than enough for a life well lived. If this story has touched your heart, be sure to subscribe to the channel for more exciting Wild West narratives. Share this video with someone who believes in the power of kindness and compassion.